Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am speaking with Zach Greenberg. Zach is a senior program officer at FIRE. He's a First Amendment attorney, and I've asked him to come on to talk about the work FIRE is doing, free speech, where we're at with free speech, and see where it goes from there. Hey Zach, thanks for coming on.
Happy to come on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I've been following FIRE for a bit. Just you know, I got back to North America around 2014, and that's when I started seeing basically secular blasphemy laws, and I was wondering what was going on, and then started seeing some of the stuff FIRE was doing, especially on campuses and stuff. So if you wouldn't mind talking a bit about that, how you got into working with them or what led you to that, and like the kind of work that they're doing.
Yeah, sure. FIRE is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit civil liberties group that defends the free speech rights of professors and students at American colleges and universities nationwide. We defend the freedom of speech, freedom of association, academic freedom, due process, religious liberty, the essential qualities of human dignity. And we do public schools, we do private schools of higher education. And my role at FIRE is I'm a senior program officer for our individual rights defense program. And that entails writing letters to schools, engaging in direct advocacy on behalf of students, professors, and student groups. We do everything from helping schools revise their policies to educating the public, talking to students, parents, teachers, professors, administrators. We lobby legislatures to pass bills that enhance students' rights at universities. And we do a limited amount of litigation against universities for particularly egregious violations of students' rights. I mostly work with student groups such as fraternities and sororities and other political groups on campus asserting their rights to free speech and free association. And I work with a lot of professors as well, protecting their academic freedom rights and their due process rights, generally to be notified of the charges and to have an opportunity to be heard prior to punishment. I got into this role because at my alma mater and at my law school, SUNY Binghamton and Syracuse Law, where Biden went, I fought for students' rights there, and I fought to revise certain policies that infringe students' rights. And here I am, 4 years later at FIRE. I'm doing the same work, just trying to fight the good fight and defend students, regardless of what they say, as long as it's protected by the First Amendment.
Okay. Like I said, I've been following it a little bit now. I see it, I'll see people saying, "Oh, you guys only defend the left," or sometimes, "Oh, you're only defending right-wing people." When you're working on it, is it pretty much even across the board? Like, do you see just as many coming from the right-wing side and the left-wing side, or is there been a bit of a shift, or how do you see that right now?
That's a great question. FIRE is proudly nonpartisan. We will defend your rights as long as you're a student or professor, regardless of what you say, your viewpoint, your political beliefs, your opinions, as long as your expression is protected under First Amendment standards. And this entails us defending a wide array of individuals, from liberals to conservatives, libertarians, communists, really any imaginable viewpoint that exists in the world also exists on a college campus. And over our 20-year history, we've seen and defended literally all of them. It may be hard to believe that, but you can look at our case archives and they're all right there. I'd say it's kind of a soup du jour of censorship. Every day, and it seems to be almost every hour, there is a new, big story happening in America, in the world. And it seems to be the censorship on college campuses tracks those big stories. For example, this past year, we've had a lot of cases regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, universities punishing students and professors for speaking out against universities' handling of the pandemic, or generally spreading their whether they perceive to be false information or conspiracy theories about the pandemic. During the year of 9/11, we had a lot of cases regarding that event and regarding support for potentially terrorist activities, and generally responses to the government in that event and the Iraq War and whatnot. And of course, in the intervening years, it seems like any single news story will attract inevitable student speech and protests about that news story, and inevitable censorship and backlash from the university and repression against students and professors talking about that issue. So in terms of whether it's been mostly conservatives or liberals, it's really a mixed bag. It's kind of an all the above approach that we've seen. And that keeps the job interesting for me. I gauge the news each day by the cases that come in and by the students who ask for our help, kind of what's happening on the ground. Because of course, we only have a couple offices, but we take cases at universities nationwide. So we don't only have people on the ground per se at all these schools, but we are able to kind of gauge temperature at these universities and kind of figure out what kind of cases are coming in and how we can best help.
Like when I look at some of these things, some of them I just have to shake my head, but those are the ones that I kind of that worry me the most. And I'll give you two examples. There was one, I think it was right after Soleimani was killed, and Iran was saying that they might destroy their own historical monuments. And some professor made a joke about, oh, well, if that was the US, it's going to be Walmart and Target and stuff like that. Okay. It was just a silly little joke, but I don't know if he got fired, but he got in trouble for that. And then there was another one recently. It was the one in, I think it was USC. The professor was talking about the Chinese word nega. And then, there's a big uproar about it. I don't think anything happened. Like, do you find those ones are worse? Like, they're kind of like, you look at it and it's like, okay, the guy made a silly joke. Why is going on? Or stuff that, gets a little bit more serious, accusations of racism or accusations of, favoritism or just trying to think of some horrible accusations. Like, which cases do you find more worrisome? Because the silly ones to me seems like, why are you wasting your time and your effort on that? And it just going after something so silly seems like you're, the big stuff I can kind of see. You can say, okay, well, that's racist. It might be against the First Amendment or something, but making a joke about blowing up your own Walmarts.
Yeah, no, it's really funny you mentioned that because I think you underscore a really essential tenet about discourse, which is that humor and satire and offensiveness is in the eye of the beholder, right? While we could sit here and laugh about a professor calling for destruction of U.S. monuments or Walmarts on Twitter and how ridiculous that is, you can understand how perhaps those online, those on Twitter, social media, Facebook, will see this as a really serious threat against their nation and not a laughing matter at all. And universities, of course, they're large institutions. They're definitely susceptible to public pressure. And of course, when that pressure comes from donors, from alumni, from their own students and their own educational community, they have to react to that pressure. So a lot of cases we see with professors, for example, and students tweeting on social media, doing their hot takes, their controversial opinions, it will create this backlash and create this large amount of pressure on these institutions to punish their students and professors for their expression. The only issue is that if the institution, if it's a private school, if it promises free speech, and if it's a state school, public school bound by the First Amendment, they are not legally allowed to do so. They may not have the authority to punish their students and their professors for their free speech, regardless of what their donors and their alumni and the public wants them to do. So in these situations, we urge the school to have a backbone, to do the right thing, to not throw its students and professors under the bus, and to defend their rights, even when it is difficult or unpopular to do so.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, it's those cases that really bug me, because if people are getting worked up by what's obviously a joke, and like what just happened at the New York Times, with what McNeil, I think the guy's name was,
the reporter.
Yeah. Or that young girl, some guy had a video of her when she was 14 and she was singing a rap song or something. And when she's about to go to college, he brings it out and gets her, gets her application removed. Mm-hmm. I worry about the state of the education, the state of what's being talked about on campus. Do you guys get a sense of that? Of the discussions on campus, from students itself, not necessarily the administration?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about saying racial slurs and the N-word. Obviously, when these these words and these words are directed towards an individual, with derogatory intent to harass them, to threaten them, to demean them, that's obviously, a really terrible thing to do. But the vast majority of the cases we see regarding professors and students getting in trouble for using these terms are simply devoid of context. They're not trying to demean anybody or call or be racist. They're simply using the word of their professor in a pedagogically relevant context, which is quoting Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, or quoting other forms of literature, sometimes from African Americans. Frederick Douglass, for example, uses the word many times in many texts that are standard curricula for English courses. And for students, a lot of times the context is in the form of a song or a lyric or another simply repetition of a cultural phenomenon. And so when we see professional students getting in trouble for this, it's really disheartening, because instead of the university using this as a teachable moment to perhaps educate its professors or students on the word and how in its context it's used, they simply punish them. They expel them, they fire them. They don't give them a chance to really explain themselves and to show perhaps the public and to the university that this word was used in an appropriate context, such as in a class about African American literature. We also bring up a good point of rescinded admissions. Universities refusing to matriculate students who otherwise would qualify to join the university, but because of what they said when they were, like you said, sometimes as young as 14, middle school, they are now going to rescind their admissions and not allow them to do so. And at FIRE, we think that this lets the student and the university off easy. It lets a student off easy because instead of giving the student a chance to have their worldviews confronted and expand their horizons and have their deepest beliefs challenged, which is the purpose of a liberal arts education, the university is saying, we don't want you here. Go back to wherever you came from. We're not going to educate you. The university lets them off easy because they are getting deprived of a chance to do what they do best, which is educate. If you rescinded admission to a student who is truly a racist, who truly has backwards views, wouldn't the university be the best place for them to educate them, to have their beliefs challenged, to perhaps enlighten them and show them the error of their ways? I think that it really does a disservice to both the university and to society, and not even mention the student, when universities do rescind their admissions to students that have these, quote unquote, wrong views.
I mean, there's, because I know, like I mentioned, you do First Amendment law. This is our arguments. Okay, I'm in Canada, so the First Amendment does not apply to me. We do not actually have free speech in Canada. We have hate speech laws. It's where you guys are, I think the U.S. has the best law, but do you think the First Amendment in a way is a detriment? And the reason I'm saying this is I think it's the best law out there. I wish we had something like that in Canada. But people can always just point to, well, that's not the government, that's a private company. Like having such a strong law gives people the feeling that they don't need to defend the principle in and of itself. Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's my takeaway from that. From what I'm seeing recently, I'm just places where you don't have that strong a law, they really want free speech, and you guys have the best law. So why don't you defend it civilly? Defend it amongst yourselves.
Yeah. People always say the argument that we have the First Amendment, America's the First Amendment. It's fine, no free speech issues. It's everything's hunky dory. But I think you bring up a great point about there's the law, there's also the culture. There's also what people actually believe and the norms that they keep when it comes to free speech. And the freedom of speech is much larger than the First Amendment. It really is an entire culture of a set of acts that you can do to promote a society that treasures the value of free expression. For example, our FIRE's CEO and President Greg Lukianoff would always talk about culture of free speech that entails not demonizing those that think differently than you do, seeking out people you disagree with and having a debate with them, being open to a wide array of views and having a sense of epistemic humility, knowing that you don't know everything, that people are not experts in every single field and that they could possibly be wrong. And this humbleness really helps an individual explore these new ideas. And the converse is that, the arrogance that I'm right and everyone else is wrong is a prelude to censorship. That's how we get, these egregious policies and laws. So, when we're talking about different nations and even different societies within college campuses, for example, we always talk about the culture of free speech and what that means and how we can foster it. And I think in any nation with the First Amendment or without the First Amendment, they can do a good job of upholding the principles of free speech by engaging in these cultural norms. And when we see these norms eroded by people that are just refusing to look at opposing views and refusing to engage either side and really refusing to believe that they could be wrong, I think that does more damage to the law than any sort of court rulings or legislation.
Like I know this is probably going a little bit far from what you do, but when you look at like I've had this happen to myself. I've had YouTube send me an email saying we can't show this video in Pakistan because the government of Pakistan isn't allowing it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm okay with that. It's not YouTube's decision. Pakistan got a hold of them. But now you're seeing places like China tracking, like so Chinese students coming to the U.S. or Canada or going to Europe to study. Chinese government's tracking them via social media. I mean, there was a story just out in Canada today. The security force being used at the visa center for Canada in China is manned by Chinese officials, and they track everyone going in getting a visa. So what would that become a First Amendment issue, or would that become trying to get social media companies to afford some, how do you get them to afford protection without taking away freedoms? I mean, if they're having the Chinese government pressure them to get information about people, or how, because also when you're dealing with something like Facebook, it's global. Which laws apply to them?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. We see this a lot with private universities where you have these institutions which are not bound by the First Amendment, kind of like YouTube, Facebook, these for-profit companies. Although I should say most universities are nonprofits. And we can't really make these kind of legalistic First Amendment arguments against them, country arguments, because that they're not bound by that. They can do what they want in terms of that stuff largely. However, they are bound by their policies, their institutional statements, and their code of conduct that they wrote, that they enforce, that they bind their students to. So when we make arguments against these institutions, we say, hey, if you're going to talk a big game, if you're going to say that you protect free speech, you have to also walk the walk. You have to protect free speech when push comes to shove, excuse me. And so, we see these private companies, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and they all, in a baseline promise to protect free speech. At the same time, they also, like you said, ban a wide array of speech depending on the country, depending on the regulatory scheme they're under, within the confines of where they operate. And in my opinion, that seems to be a bit of a bait and switch there. How can you say that you defend free speech when you censor every single video critical of the Chinese government? And same thing with YouTube. How can you profess to defend free speech and uphold free speech when at the same time videos that offend some government somewhere in the world, whether it's Turkey or England or Germany or China, will get removed? So it's kind of the same thing with the private university. If you're going to make these statements, you're going to profess to be an institution that hopes and promises free speech. To us, that means the First Amendment. That means the laws and the dictates are very clear, which speech is unprotected, which speech you can and cannot punish. And we hold these universities to that standard, that if you promise students free speech, they expect rights commiserate with the First Amendment. And if you don't give them those rights, then that's problematic.
Just want to get off, just veer a little bit on this. You'd mentioned you'd gotten out of, I think you mentioned you were at Fiverr for about 4 years now. When you were in school, do you see it getting, when you're now working with FIRE, looking at what's going on in universities, from when you were in school, do you see it, the support for, free speech, the support for dialogue, the support for debate, do you see that going down even more? I've noticed it. I said, I came back in 2014 and I went to school in the late late 80s, early 90s. And from then I totally noticed like what I'm seeing on campus now as opposed to when I was there. It's a huge shift. But even for yourself in that like 4 or 5 year span, do you see like a big drop or?
It's kind of hard to generalize like that. Like we have done some surveys, fire that does show that there's declining respect and knowledge of free speech principles. There's definitely some issues there in terms of students understanding and respecting the First Amendment and kind of agreeing with it. There's definitely students out there, perhaps a large amount, that think we should ban hate speech and that that we shouldn't allow people to spread false information and generally support rise in the First Amendment and doing away with these very broad free speech protections that America has into a model like Canada or Europe that has diluted and weaker free speech protections. But it really does depend on each college, depends on each demographic, each state. It's really hard to generalize across college campuses, generally across age groups. So I can only speak about my experience that, at Syracuse Law when I was there in 2016, I'd say there was a healthy respect for free speech. There definitely were some groups that really did not want to hear opposing viewpoints. They want to bring in opposing speakers, kind of were there for their own purposes, and that's it. And I think in many law schools across America, you will see a mix of students that really are there to learn and expand their worldview, and those that are kind of there just to ram their views in other people's throats and to kind of retreat into their echo chambers and not really engage in this marketplace of ideas that is the university campus. So it's hard to say what's getting better or getting worse. What I do worry about is that if we have a generation of students that are not really well versed in these principles of free speech, First Amendment, cultural norms, they're undoubtedly going to bring these viewpoints into larger society, and so we'll see their efforts to suppress speech not only in the university but in their other groups. These are the future leaders of society. So when they enter the fields of politics, business, law, medicine, we do worry that they're going to bring these these hostile views towards free speech into these organizations and spread them.
I mean, like kind of staying with this, I'm trying to remember what year it was. It might have been 2018 or 2019. I think ACLU was doing. I don't know if Fire was involved, but I know the ACLU was involved. They were doing like a tour, like a free speech tour or something like that. And you had groups on campus coming up and saying that they're calling it right wing, they're calling it white supremacist, ideals. They're saying, oh, that's only white supremacists like free speech. When did that start coming up? Because I mean, free speech was always a left-wing thing. If you want to, I don't like the left-right thing anymore. It doesn't make much sense because it's just kind of so blurred. But when did that kind of shift happen? Like, oh, like I don't remember white supremacists being too up on like freedom of expression.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're right. Free speech used to be a very left-wing viewpoint that the right was trying to suppress pornography and unpatriotic acts and other the very conservative censorship part of speech, and the left was saying no, we should have the right to criticize the government and to have sexual expression, and now it seems to be reversed because now many on the left are saying we shouldn't have the right to express views that are considered racist or sexist or hostile towards minorities, and so I think it goes to show that people do not want to hear views they disagree with. People don't want to give free speech rights to those they disagree with. It's kind of the principle of free speech. So you have to give these rights to those that oppose you. And the point that Fire makes is that the First Amendment of free speech has always been on the side of the ethnic, religious, the political minority. You can go back to the founding of our nation. You go back to the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, the women's rights movement. These are all civil rights movements that exist because of a robust First Amendment. You have people like Frederick Douglass and MLK out there saying without the First Amendment, we'd be doomed. It'd be even more difficult than it is already to fight for change. And so, when we hear these arguments that free speech is a tool for white supremacists and a tool for racists to expound their viewpoints, we simply say that, look, the First Amendment has always been used to oppose those in power, to oppose the majority viewpoints, to allow minorities, in any sense of the word, to have a voice. And if you're wealthy or powerful, you don't need free speech because your right to speak is protected by your wealth and your power. It is a tool for minorities to advocate for the changes that they believe would be the best for society, like civil rights. And it's a tool for really all of us to have an equal voice and to, and to really advocate for whatever passions that drive us. So, it's a very natural, reaction to say that those who disagree with me that have opposing views should be censored, shouldn't be able to talk. But, we like to remind people that if you give the government that power, it's pretty clear how it's going to be used. It's going to be used by those critical of the government, which has historically been, journalists, religious figures, minority politicians, revolutionaries, really any sort of minority in any country. They're the people that are going to be really censored and oppressed by these new restrictions on free speech.
This is like, okay, free speech is about the only dog I have in any fight. When it comes to that, I just, I'm like, if you can't talk about it, the rest just doesn't matter. Like, if you can't have that discussion. So that's why I kind of harp on this. And it's like this idea of harm, if you say that, that's going to cause harm to that person or that community. When I left in 2002, and it was, pretty much the, I may not agree with you, but I'll defend your right to say it. And I came back. It's like, I come back and I see a video from a journalism professor. I think it was at Missouri State, or wherever, and she's calling for muscle to remove a student journalist from a protest. I'm like, if she's teaching journalism, what's going to happen with the next crop of reporters? And then you see the New York Times now, and you kind of guess, well, gee, I wonder where that came from. So like that idea of harm. When did that? I mean, it's not that I want people going out there being, assholes to everyone, but but like this idea of harm, like, isn't that what a university is supposed to be about? Like, having ideas that challenge you, make you think. I mean, if it's just pablum going down, like, what's the point? Like, why are you paying $60,000 a year for that?
Yeah. It's funny because you hear the old nursery rhyme, right? Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That's not really true, though, right? Like, I think we can all agree that words are incredibly powerful. They can really, really hurt someone. They can drive them to anger, to madness. They can get people to kill themselves. They can inspire whole movements. Words are like all we have, right? Words are like the most important thing out there. And so, there's no denying the power of words. And of course, that is, of course, the power to do harm and to hurt people. It's definitely up there. And I think the real question is, what is our response, right? What is our response to really harmful words? Is it going to be censorship and violence and prison and jail, or is it going to be more speech and a fire? We always say the answer to speech you don't like is more speech. If you teach students from a very early age that they have to call the cops whenever someone says something they dislike, or you have to call the administrator whenever somebody insults them, that's the kind of person you're breeding. That's the kind of culture that you're raising, that we need to respond to bad speech with violence and censorship and government sanctions. FIRE believes in the strong student model, that students are wise enough to understand hateful speech. They're mature enough to counter it, and they're definitely smart enough to understand opposing viewpoints and research and kind of have these wild back and forth debates about these increasingly important public issues. And so we urge students here at universities to foster a culture where debate and dialogue is wide open, and that inevitably you are going to get harmed and insulted, and perhaps there's going to be some mental anguish there about confronting those with divergent beliefs. But that's kind of the rite of passage. It's kind of the training ground for being a leader in a democratic society. That it's hard to really do anything. Fight for any viewpoint you want without getting insulted and ridiculed and being exposed in the court of public opinion. My grandfather would used to say that there was always condemnation for those with high spirits. Really, anything you advocate for, anything in the world, you will get criticized for, regardless of whatever it is. And so the answer is you can either shrink away from it and not do it, or go out there and stand by your statements and really fight the good fight. And so we have a lot of literature on the harm for alleged hate speech and how to combat it and know what the answers are. But in general, we just believe that the answer is more speech.
I mean, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but do you think it, like part of the problem is education? Like I was looking at some of the stats, and I was just speaking to someone about this, and I think there's only 2 states that require a civics course to graduate from high school.
Hmm.
So the rest of it's got kind of mixed into social science and stuff like that. Do you think that plays a big part of it? Like, I mean, that's one thing I'm seeing. I mean, you see it here in Canada. I see it, I hear about it in the States, where you're almost ashamed of your past. I mean, like I'm seeing that in Europe as well. Like it's uh, the like the way they look at the past, especially in Canada now. It's all about how we, genocide committed against First Nations. And I'm not saying hide that. Like I don't want, but speak honestly about it. And it's, you know, like they want to hide the past. I think it was in Sweden, the foreign minister said, what happens if the Swedish culture dies? Who cares? It doesn't matter. Like, or what's going on at the universities in the UK right now. Leicester University wants to get rid of Chaucer, and I think they want to get rid of like their whole medieval English department. I mean, like, is there a problem in education that needs to be looked at? Like where you're afraid of your own past, you're kind of embarrassed of it, like for some reason or other, like if you don't have a connection to the past, how can you connect to those ideals that made your country?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that's happening because, of course, part of free speech is that you want to question, your culture, your society, your views, you question your orthodoxy, try to make your society better. And of course, FIRE doesn't, take any stance in the content of the issues that we defend. We're not going to come out and say that some issues are good or bad or whatnot. We're simply to defend free speech, not partisans. But I think it is interesting how students are being taught from a young age, whether it's high school or, freshman year college onwards, that, they should not pursue a wide range of knowledge. They should simply be taught to think what they think and, be taught that there's only, one right answer and one way forward, and to kind of go through life that way. I think that's very harmful, especially for a young person, to kind of be so solidified in their views that they can't go to college and have their worldviews questioned and kind of have the classical liberal arts education where they are exposed to a wide array of viewpoints, make up their own decisions. I'm not going to call it like brainwashing or anything like that, but definitely seems to be some effort in some colleges and in high schools to force students to really only have one viewpoint when it comes to these really controversial issues that students should undoubtedly be free to think for themselves on. This is, like you said, happening across the world, where you see some programs almost designed for students to have this very singular viewpoint. And so at FIRE, we have a large case, a case archives against compelled speech. Universities telling students that you have to sign a form saying, I believe in this, I believe in that, I believe that, for example, race is a social construct, or that this is on stolen land or whatnot. And so we fight back against that. We say that, look, your job is to teach students how to think, not what to think, and that as adults, they have the right to not be forced to, swear loyalty oaths and to state their viewpoints out there and to swear that I believe this as a condition for continued education.
Yeah, no, like I said, I'm looking at this and I still shake my head, like where's some of this stuff coming from? I mean, the whole harm that you're going to do with speech, and you have to stop it because you might hurt someone. Like I've made this argument with a couple of people. I'm like, take a look at the Islamic world. So the Middle East, more so than anywhere else, you had, around 1000, 1100 AD, just before the Mongols came in, like the shift happened where even some of their own thinkers, they stopped teaching them in the Middle East. They said, they were exiled, and you couldn't. I think still to this day there are people like Averroes and Avicenna that you can't read in the Middle East. You can't study there. So you had that come in, and you can see, like, how many Muslim Nobel prize winners are there? You could, like, there's nothing made in the Middle East. I mean, they pump oil out of there. Like, there's no inventions that come out of there. Recently, you had something coming out with LIGO. Like, if you follow the science stuff, like the gravitational lensing telescope, there was a Muslim involved with that. But again, it's education where they don't show parts of the world. Like, sometimes I feel like, Canadians, but I think Americans to more of an extent, like, no insult meant to Americans, where they think everyone's got the First Amendment, everyone's got free speech. They don't realize that it's a very special thing that you guys have down there. And, like,
Yeah.
like, is it just maybe? I used to joke when I came back from Afghanistan that, send some of these high school and college kids to Kabul for a month or so and let them see how it's like out there.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. Is
Uh,
it is it just not exposure, or is again maybe like education or what? I don't know.
No, that's a good point. Yeah, I think a lot of Americans, especially the COVID pandemic, haven't traveled abroad. They haven't really experienced other cultures. We think it's a good thing that people look at other societies and say, look what's happening here. We have our Home and Abroad project of FIRE, where we do examine the free attitudes of these different countries, of their laws and their policies and how they affect universities. And it's a whole wide world out there. And most of the world, and mostly throughout history, there's really no respect for free speech. My Greg Vigenov calls it the eternally radical idea that we shouldn't burn people at the stake for having different beliefs. It's really only recently in America, and of course, recently in many parts of the world, that they're still not executing people for what they believe, and that the beliefs go against what society believes. So it is kind of a crazy concept, the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the right to express ourselves, and is very unique in America. And it's kind of why we fight to preserve it. That we have this very, very unique freedom that we think is responsible for a lot of really good things in our society, especially in college campuses. The quintessential marketplace of ideas, where students are to be expected to have these debates and discussions and really develop their leadership skills and expand their worldviews. And, it's really a shame that many countries out there simply don't have that or don't respect it. And, at FIRE, we fight to preserve the First Amendment on college campuses because it's so rare, because it's so fleeting. And we feel that even like these what people consider to be minuscule attacks on the First Amendment, one student expelled for one thing they said, really affects all of us. That if the university can get away with punishing people for their beliefs, then that's just a canary in the coal mine. If that's going to be okay, if you're going to pardon that offense, then who knows what's next. It really is a slippery slope. Seeing how fragile free speech can be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't get it. I mean, I'm looking at all these things. Just that, oh well, it's just a student. He didn't get on a committee or something, like, or she didn't get on a committee. It's like, what's the big deal? Like, they're still in school. It's like, it's those deaths by 1,000 cuts, like, where you're not respecting. It's like, okay, then what's your line? Like, where are you gonna draw the line? Say, okay, beyond this, like, you can't stop. And it just, that's again, like, I hate the arguments of it's a private company, they can do what they want. Especially when it's social media. I think we should, like, if I was qualified to do it, I'd do it. I'd say, we need someone to do an Areopagitica 2.0. So take the arguments Milton made for the printing press and update them for social media, because I think we really need that.
100%.
I mean, yes, Twitter's privately owned, but if a bunch of people stop me from speaking on a corner outside, like public space, they're just, well, oh, you can go speak wherever else you want. But no, you've taken away my right to speech by stopping me from speaking there, and that's how I kind of equate Twitter. I mean, it is our public space, and I just see it slipping everywhere, and people are just letting the little things slide. I'm like, don't let the little thing slide. Like, like the professor who got fired for saying, our monuments are the Walmarts. Like, just silly thing, but the guy lost his livelihood for that.
Yeah,
and he shouldn't.
Yeah, it matters at least to one person. It matters at least to the guy who got expelled or got fired for their beliefs, and it mattered to everyone else. But it's definitely an interesting point how, like, you have these social media companies, Twitter and Facebook, that are like the public square, right? They're how people communicate. Your president of the United States issuing executive orders through Twitter. It's definitely like how people get their news. And if people look to Facebook or Twitter as a source of news, as a source like this for society is, then Twitter is suppressing those beliefs. Twitter's filtering out information and taking people off that for having bad beliefs. It paints a very sort of picture of society. It really paints a misrepresentation of what is on there. Twitter can curate its content to only have, no hate speech, no Nazis or whatnot. So it's really a distorting effect, kind of like, what China and Turkey are doing, that, the purging their academies, universities of academics that have opposing views. And so naturally you have these research papers and scientific studies coming out praising the government And, how can we really trust what they have to say when there's literally no one there who can speak out against this? Because if they were there, they would get, imprisoned or fired. Academic freedom is kind of like the filtering process, right? Based on this back and forth of ideas, we can arrive at the truth, right? We have these discussions, and based on all these different debates, we're able to figure out, we're able to divine what the actual facts are. But if you distort the process by suppressing people's free speech and by saying some views are off limits, then how can you really trust the results?
Yeah. Just want to, like I said, I don't want to keep you too much longer. But I want to ask you one last thing, and it's again about the education. Did they stop? Okay, so liberal democracy. So democracy is based off the Enlightenment. We're the only ones that'll go back and look back and say, you know what, like in the U.S., like slavery was wrong. What happened to natives was wrong. In Canada, we can look back at everything that was done to the First Nations. The UK can talk about colonization, and we can look back at ourselves self-reflectively and try to improve. But China like bans everything about Tiananmen Square. You're not allowed saying Taiwan. Like what? There are people who don't know any people living in China that don't know about the Uyghurs.
Yeah.
So, like, can't you push that message? Like, I don't know, like how you could do it, or maybe, I mean, obviously FIRE's got a lot on their plate, but it's, where the story is not that we're perfect. The story is the progress that's been made. And it's like, okay, America founded 1776, and no matter what Nicole Hannah-Jones says, 100 years later, slavery ends. It takes another 100 years or so for all Jim Crow and like Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, and taught like, shouldn't that story be the story of progress and how it's gone and how we actually, like, we do look back and say, you know what, we were awful people back then. Let's try to do better.
Yeah.
I don't know if, again, like it's an education thing, or, maybe we need more after school specials or something. I have no idea.
Yeah. It's interesting. It was really easy to censor things, make them disappear, 200 years ago, right? You have like Alexander the Great writing propaganda about his campaigns, 1,000 years ago. And it's really easy to kind of erase history because there was really no internet. There was no, written word. It's kind of like, all right, well, what we have is these guys who obviously were the victors who wrote their stories. You don't really have anything else. But in today's day and age, even with China's Great Firewall and censorship, it's really, really hard to completely erase something. And so you have these situations where people do try to, erase and reform their history and try to forget, some embarrassing instant in their national history. Try to govern Tiananmen Square is a perfect example. And it lives on, it lives on and collect the memory of the nations that do have free speech, that do allow their citizens to learn about this thing. And so it almost creates a Streisand effect where you have the fact that someone tried to censor it. Now it's blowing up. Now people are even more acutely aware of Tiananmen Square and more acutely aware of America's history with race and our, our national founding because of efforts to suppress it. And I think it's a really beautiful concept because it kind of goes to show that in this day and age, free speech will win out, that the collective conscience will remember, and that despite the best efforts of the most powerful institutions in the world, to suppress these viewpoints and to really erase history, it cannot happen. With the internet and with the written word and with the advent of history, modern history, it becomes a very difficult job for the censor to really thoroughly and adequately censor somebody or some idea.
Okay. Well, thanks. Like I said, I don't want to keep you too long, but if you want to let people know where they can get a hold of you, and if you got any last words of, how to get people to think about free speech, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I'm a big fan of Canada, especially your hockey teams. It's my favorite sport. I'm, Long Island Islanders fan, but you guys always beat us. So hopefully take it easy next couple of years. And yeah, to learn more about FIRE and about free speech, visit our website at thefire.org. We have information, resources. You can contact with us if you are a student or professor who has believed the rights are violated. Please get in contact with us. Like I said, thefire.org. We're happy to review your case and see if we can help out. And like I said, I really appreciate you having me on and having this discussion.
Well, thanks a lot, and thanks everyone for listening. I'll be back.